The new Italian tank destroyers are here in World of Tanks, and of course today we're having a quick look at them as well as the weak points so you know exactly how to take them out, because their armor models are very annoying in some cases. So let's get right into it and go from the beginning of the tech tree, starting off with, of course, the Semovente M41. So this tank is a typical non-turreted tank destroyer, as with the following tank as well, the Bassotto, but we'll get onto that in a second. The armor model of this tank is terrible. I mean, it's got 50mm of armor, and that is the effective armor as well. And of course, then the tank has some plated elements, which is essentially this larger upper plate, which is quite bouncy. And of course, if you hit there, which is typically the auto aim location, then you can end up bouncing off of these things. So just make sure that when you see these in the game, you're actually able to pen them. But other than that, the armor is pretty trash, and you're going to be able to quite easily go through these tanks and come away with a win. But the key thing about these is that they do have pretty decent main armaments, and of course with 2000, nearly 300 damage per minute as a tier 5 tank destroyer, it's pretty disgusting. And of course we aren't using any perks because on console this is based off of PC, so the values might slightly change when you actually jump onto the game. Of course, you can obviously check it against them, but essentially what we have here is 110 damage on the main armament, which is more than enough for most tanks to really kick out a ton of damage, because it is that fast firing, and it has a reload speed of 2.88 seconds, so you can track and deal damage with these things. They have decent penetration on the premium rounds for a tier 5, 175mm, which is very good, and for the most part you'll be able to go through everything you meet, even the tier 7s that you're meeting, things like the Tiger 1, you know, the Tiger P, the IS, that sort of stuff, easy to pen with the heat rounds of this thing, and makes it very, very good. Key thing though is to note that the actual gun constraints essentially is pretty bad. You've got you do have 8 degrees of gun depression, but the problem is you also then only have 23 degrees or 32 degrees total side to side, so it's not particularly that great, and effectively you're going to find yourself hating life just a little bit. It's a pretty small gun arc, and yeah, it's going to be a pain. But key thing as well is that the view range of these tanks is not amazing. 350 meters, it's still good, and you're probably going to want to use this as more of a hidden tank. You want to use your camo, your advanced concealment, your advanced optics, to be able to remain undetected and just pump people from the back of the map in a bush somewhere. And that's kind of how these tanks play, or at least the tier 5. But obviously we've seen the armor, not particularly anything to write home about on the tier 5. The gun looks good, very bad dispersion though, so hopefully on console the accuracy gets slightly better. But yeah, that's the tier 5. Let's move on to the tier 6, which is one very interesting tank, which is the Bassotto. And this tank at tier 6 has 440 alpha, yeah, 440, and that makes this thing very, very powerful, and it also reloads super quick for the amount of damage it's dealing. So in this, on PC, which of course might slightly differ, it has 440 damage with 0.44 dispersion, which isn't awful. I mean, it's not great, but of course that is why you're getting 440 alpha. It has 3,400 damage per minute, making this one of the highest, if not the highest, tank destroyer DPM at this tier, especially for the alpha that it has. And you might be thinking, well, yeah, but it's got a HE round with 105 pen. You're not going to be able to pen much. Don't worry though, because it has heat rounds with 230 pen and 360 damage. So this thing is very, very capable of dealing with anything that you come up against, and essentially at the same tier you're going to pen everything with those HE rounds, and then if you're coming in a higher tier game you're going to want to load those heat rounds so you can basically deal with anything like the tier 8 wise, the heavy tanks, etc. 230 is more than enough for those. If you're aiming at weak points, etc. View range, once again, you'll probably want to take some concealment to remain undetected, because you'll need that for when you're trying to relocate in this tank, because it's not the fastest, so you want to make sure that you do relocate early enough enough. But of course, let's have a look at the armor. Armor-wise, it is much like the previous, very bad. You're going to pen this thing easily with basically everything that you have, and there isn't even an auto ricochet angle off the upper plate on this thing. So yeah, I mean, it's very, very easy to pen. And of course, just make sure that when this thing hits you, hopefully it bounces. But you're returning the favor back to them, because yeah, it's going to be a pain for sure if you're not using the tank correctly and you're getting pumped by this thing with 440 alpha. The good thing once again with this tank is it has 10 degrees gun depression, meaning that it is very, very consistent, and of course very good in general, even if it doesn't have the best accuracy in the game. But next up we then have the tier 7. So this is where the Italian TDs start to become more like the Italian TDs, and effectively what you have with this tank is starting to get that ridiculous frontal armor, and this is the tier 7. This one is the SMV CC-56, and essentially what this tank has is that really strong turret armor, whereby the key weak points of this tank are left and right of the cheeks. And if we load the premium rounds, not necessarily, but essentially left and right of the cheeks. If you've got like ridiculous pen, if you're like a 2 tiers higher and you're firing premium, then yeah, you'll be able to pen through left and right of the cheek, but you have to avoid the mantlet, etc., because otherwise it will just bounce. There is some cupolas on the top of the tank, but they're very small, so trying to hit them is just, yeah, I mean, it's just a pain. And the big lower plate is where you'll want to be hitting this tank, obviously. One thing to note, though, is as soon as these sort of tanks start giving you the side of their turret, it's very easy to pen them. You want to be aiming for the flattest part of when you see them. So in the visual model, you'll see as soon as he starts to do this, this becomes flat, easy pen in there. And that's where you want to be aiming. And of course, as soon as it starts to over-rotate the hull from the standard position, you can actually go through the side of the tank, through the tracks, and pen these things really easily, making them just hate themselves for having this sort of armor. The top speed, not particularly great. A terrible DPM. This is where it starts to get the autoloader. So essentially you get a 3-shot autoloader with a 7-second intricate reload, which really kills off these tanks in World of Tanks console. And yeah, I mean, there are just so many other options that I feel like are better at tier 7 for a tank destroyer. And this one, yeah, I mean, it doesn't even get like super good damage either. So yeah, the tier 7, it's pretty weak. Obviously not with the armor, because it's very good for the tier, but certainly as soon as you start moving to the side, it becomes terrible, and the DPM is awful, along with the accuracy being pretty bad as well. But it does get 10 degrees of gun depression, so ridge lines are your friend with this. And of course the view range goes actually down from the tier 5. So yeah, pretty good. But anyway, moving on, the tier 8. What do we have in the SMV CC-67? This is actually the better of the tier 8 tank destroyers, I believe, on PC. This one is actually better than the premium, which is very, very unusual for World of Tanks to do that. And that is because it literally just doesn't have any top weak points. I mean, literally none. And the lower plate is kind of a little bit troll. You've got this 200mm bar, which you have to hit if you want to pen it from the front. So it's possible to pen with most tanks at the tier. So yeah, you want to be aiming for that flat bar. So visually, this is the area where you want to be aiming. You'll see that it's kind of like your typical American tank sort of lower plate, so you want to be aiming there. And then of course, as soon as it starts giving you the side, you can pen through the drive wheel very easily. And then of course you've got the side of the turret if that's the only thing you can see. Side armor's garbage as usual with these Italian TDs, so yeah, not particularly the funnest, but once again, it's in the game, it should be pretty interesting. 10 degrees of gun depression, once again 35 kilometers an hour top speed is good. And of course, yeah, looking like a pretty solid tank at tier 8. Of course, starting to get the view range back up from the tier 6. So yeah, looking like a decent one, probably better than the Vipera, and I think that is the general consensus from the PC community. But let's go back and have one last look at the two top tier vehicles, which is the CC Mark II and the Minotauro. So The CC Mark II is essentially the tier 9. This is where you start to get increased alpha of the main armament. So 490 alpha, pretty good. And you're going to be able to pump people very nicely. 8-second intricate reload, oh, it's just horrible. So that would take you 24 seconds to actually clip the entirety of whatever you're shooting, and you're dealing 1960 damage in that clip. 0.4 dispersion is okay, nothing ridiculous, but once again, yeah, you will be wanting to take as many of the accuracy buffs you can. 2,500 DPM is okay, but once again, with these sorts of tanks, it's very difficult to fire as soon as you're reloaded it in the autoloader. So yeah, sometimes you just end up with long periods of time where you're not dealing any damage. You've got 10 degrees of gun depression once again, and 1900 health, etc. So yeah, these tanks very, very good with its armor model, but once again, it is a big old slab, and effectively there aren't really any turret weak points of this tier 9. And essentially what you have to do is, if you are looking at it from here, there's a weak point underneath the flaps, which you can pen up into if you're looking at this thing over a ridge, or the lower plate, which you can go for. Yeah, just a very, very solid frontal armor vehicle, only really pennable in that lower plate. So that is the Contracaro Mark II, and then similarly we have the top tier, which gains an extra 40 damage per shell. It gets 5 in the autoloader, which means it has a total clip potential of 2,650 damage, which is perfect to be able to really counter a lot of people that might be pushing a flank. This thing in World of Tanks PC is essentially just a blocker for the enemy team. Like, it is just a pain in the backside, and effectively you see this in the game, you just leave. I mean, 400mm on the weakest point, even on the Cabolas when it's using its gun depression, is disgusting. The actual ability to try and hit it is actually limited on that lower plate. It's no longer flat. It's like the American tanks with the boat-shaped hull, which is essentially stops you from penning the left-hand side. So yeah, just slimming down the shots on the lower plate with this thing, and effectively very, very good frontal armor. And yeah, I mean, this is just a boring tank to both play because of that huge intricate reload of 8 seconds, but also a very boring tank to play against if it is facing you directly. It's just basically one of those things where you have to just leave. So yeah, not particularly too happy about it, but view range wise, it's pretty lackluster. 390 at tier 10, it's okay. Can be boosted all the way up to probably like 480 on console, so I mean, it might not be the worst thing in the world, but yeah, could definitely do with just maintaining your kind of accuracy perks and making sure that you do put on a few view range perks and equipment if possible, if you have the silver, etc. 10 degrees of gun depression once again, so very good. 0.42 dispersion, so slightly worse, but a very, very good Italian tank destroyer. So hopefully that's given you an idea as to all of them. The kind of key highlights are the tier 6, which is very good, the Bassotto, the tier 8, I believe, is very good, and then of course the tier 9 and 10 are kind of decent tanks, but just annoying to play sometimes. So just keep an eye out for them in the game, and of course let me know what you think about them. Have you purchased them? Are you trying them out right now? And yeah, I'll be interested to see what you guys think of. And of course, I am on holiday right now, so I'll be answering a ton of comments as I'll be probably sitting by the pool. So I'm sorry if you're working, I'll be there chilling by the pool with a drink. So either way, hopefully you did enjoy, and hopefully you join me back in the next video tomorrow, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.